Nobody remembered the last time silence had been the loudest thing in the Halcyon dome. The chamber rose in perfect tiers round a circular floor of black glass, its ceiling a vast lattice of transparent alloy through which the swirling nebula of the Virith expanse bled soft blue light across 400 alien delegations. It was the oldest surviving structure of the Concordance, 8,000 years of treaties signed, wars averted, and species quietly broken beneath its dome. Today, for the first time in its history, 3 humans stood at its center and did not bow. Ambassador Daniel Cho kept his hands loosely folded in front of him, his charcoal suit unremarkable among the ceremonial robes surrounding him. Behind his right shoulder stood Priya Anand, Humanity's junior attach, a slim data tablet glowing faintly in her hands. Behind his left, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb stood with the stillness of a man who had learned, long ago on Earth's own battlefields. That stillness unsettled people far more than posturing ever could. High Curator Sulin Vey occupied the raised dais above them, his tall, angular frame draped in ceremonial silverwork, for narrow eyes fixed on the human delegation with the patient contempt of something that had never once been told no. Ambassador Cho Vey said, his voice threading through the chamber's translation lattice, smooth and unhurried. Humanity's expansion has been noted with considerable interest. 9 systems in 26 years. Remarkable for a species so recently confined to a single rock. Cho said nothing. He had learned, across 3 months of preliminary contact, that the Concordance mistook silence for submission every time. The Curatorial Council has prepared terms of integration, Vey continued, gesturing, and a holographic document bloomed above the dais in shifting amber light. Humanity will transfer full command authority of its orbital shipyards, Ceres, Titan, and the Kessler Ring to Concordance oversight. Your fusion drive schematics, developed by the entity you call Halcyon Dynamics, will be entered into the shared archive, freely available to all 400 member species. A ripple of quiet approval moved through the tiered galleries. Your border fleet, Vey went on, will be reduced to a ceremonial escort, no more than 15 vessels. In exchange, the Concordance offers humanity a probationary seat at the outer table, and the protection of our Sentinel fleet along your borders, subsidized, naturally, by a modest export levy of 50% on refined isotopes and rare hydrogen. Priya's tablet chimed softly. She did not look up. This is not a negotiation, Ambassador, Vey said, and something almost gentle entered his tone. The practiced warmth of a predator that had never needed to raise its voice. This is generosity. Every species that has entered this dome uninvited has faced the same choice. Accept guidance and thrive under it, or resist and be dismantled slowly, piece by prideful piece. The chamber waited. This was always the moment new species begged for a smaller tariff, a longer timeline, a scrap of dignity within the arrangement. Cho reached down and set his briefcase on the obsidian podium in front of him. Click, clack, the latches snapped open, sharp and foreign in a chamber built for softer sounds. Vey's eyes narrowed at the noise. Unfamiliar and vaguely insulting, Cho withdrew a single sheet of paper, an anachronism, deliberate, unnerving to species who had abandoned physical documents millennia ago, and set it face down on the podium without reading from it. High Curator, Cho said, his voice calm, almost bored, carrying easily through the translation lattice. I want to be certain I understand the terms correctly. You are requesting our shipyards, our propulsion technology, and a 50% tariff in exchange for a probationary seat in a fleet we didn't ask to be protected by. You understand perfectly, Vey said, pleased. Good, Cho said, because the answer is no. The murmuring in the galleries stopped, as though someone had cut a transmission mid-sentence. No, Vey repeated, testing the word like something distasteful. Ambassador, I do not believe you grasp the position your species occupies. The Sentinel fleet sits 4 jumps from your home system. Refusal is not survival, Ambassador Cho. It is merely delay. Cho closed the briefcase. Snap. Snap. He rose from his seat. Webb and Priya rose with him. The motion so precisely timed it looked rehearsed, because it was. They had run this exact contingency in a briefing room in Geneva 3 weeks earlier, more times than Cho cared to remember. We came to this dome in good faith, Cho said. And now he let his voice fill the chamber. Let every one of the 400 delegations hear him clearly. We came prepared to offer partnership. Instead, we were offered a leash, dressed up as mercy. That tells us everything we need to know about how the Concordance treats species it considers beneath it. You dare? Vey began, his composed tone finally cracking. We dare, Cho said. To leave. He turned. Webb fell into step at his shoulder, eyes already tracking the chamber's exit with the flat calm of a man who had memorized every door in the room before the session had even begun. Priya followed, tablet tucked beneath her arm, spine straight, expression unreadable. The dome erupted. Delegates surged upright across all 15 tiers. A chaotic wash of alien voices overlapping in the translation lattice. Outrage, mockery, disbelief, and beneath all of it, something the Concordance had not felt in 8,000 years of unchallenged rule. Uncertainty. Halt. Vey's voice cracked through the amplification system. All trace of patronizing warmth gone. Walk through those doors, Ambassador, and diplomatic protection is void. You will be classified a rogue actor. The Sentinel fleet will not wait for your regrets. Cho didn't slow his pace. 2 armored Thrall guards crossed ceremonial energy pikes at the chamber's exit, blocking the path. Webb walked straight toward them without breaking stride. His eyes locked on theirs with the particular stillness of a man who had once stared down insurgents in the ruins of a war zone and had never once needed to blink first. The guards held for exactly 2 seconds. Then, for reasons neither of them could have articulated, they stepped aside. The vast doors hissed open. The 3 humans walked through, and the doors sealed shut behind them with a heavy, final thud, cutting off 8,000 years of unbroken certainty inside the dome. High Curator Aslan Vey stood motionless at his podium, staring at the empty space where the human delegation had stood only moments before. The single sheet of paper Cho had left behind still lay face down on the obsidian surface, untouched. He had expected fury. He had expected begging. He had never, in 8 millennia, expected them to simply walk away, unhurried, unafraid, as though the most powerful body in the known galaxy had already become irrelevant to whatever came next. Something cold coiled beneath Vey's ceremonial collar, a feeling his species had no ready word for. They didn't look like something that had just lost, he thought. They looked like something that already knew what was coming and had simply decided. We weren't worth the warning. He was right to feel afraid. He simply had no idea yet how right. 4 hours after the walkout, the Halcyon dome still hadn't settled. High Curator Aslan Vey sat in his private annex, a narrow chamber of dim amber light just off the main assembly floor, surrounded by what remained of his war council. Fleet Marshal Corvin Thess stood over a floating tactical display, already sketching projected routes toward the Soul Corridor with quick, irritated strokes. 9 days to mobilize the first Sentinel wing, Thess said, jabbing a clawed finger at the small blue marker representing Earth. Their border defenses are competent, but conventional. We overwhelm with numbers and force renegotiation before they've had time to regret their theatrics. Do not underestimate them, Vey murmured. He hadn't touched the cup of resin tea cooling in front of him. Thess made a short, dismissive sound. They walked out to save face. Curator. Wounded pride. Give it a rotation. They'll send an envoy crawling back through those doors within the week, begging for the very terms they just refused. The annex door slid open. A junior communications officer stumbled in, his pale membrane flushing in anxious violet, a species tale they had learned to recognize as genuine alarm rather than routine urgency. Curator, forgive the interruption. It's the human embassy. Okay. Vey's 4 eyes lifted. They've returned to request terms. No, Curator. The officer's voice wavered. They're gone. All of it. Embassy staff, security personnel, archived records, the entire compound evacuated within the last hour. Their transport vessel, registered as the UNSC Meridian, broke orbit and entered slipstream 11 minutes ago. Barked out a short laugh, running home with their tails tucked. Cowards, exactly as I predicted. Sir, you misunderstand. The officer thumbed his data slate, hands trembling badly enough that he nearly dropped it. They didn't jump toward Seoul. Our tracking shows a heading toward the Van Tar Sea deep, unmapped space, well beyond any charted concordance territory. And before they severed the connections, they broadcast a message, system-wide. Every relay station in the concordance intercepted it. Vey set down his tea with deliberate control, the only outward sign of the dread tightening beneath his ribs. Play it. The officer complied, and a holographic projection bloomed at the center of the annex ambassador, Daniel Cho, seated now on the bridge of a departing vessel, streaking stars visible through the viewport at his back. He looked entirely unbothered, as though recording a routine briefing rather than addressing the single most powerful political body in known space. Hi, Curator Vey, members of the concordance. Cho's recorded voice was flat, unhurried, carrying none of the heat from the chamber walkout. By the time this reaches you, we'll be beyond your tracking range. I want to correct a misunderstanding before we go. We didn't come to the Halcyon Dome today to beg for a better tariff. We came to warn you that your tariff will be the least of your concerns very shortly. Thes's laughter died mid-breath. 14 months ago, Cho continued, our deep-range observatories detected a gravitational disturbance entering the outer edge of this galactic arm. Not a fleet, not a migrating species, something our scientists have designated the undertow. A self-propagating stellar collapse phenomenon that destabilizes star systems from the inside, triggering premature core failure across entire clusters as it passes. The projection shifted, displaying a tactical rendering that made even Vey's ancient composure falter, a slow, spreading network of dimming star markers. Entire sectors going dark in sequence, like candles snuffed one after another down a long hall. Spent 14 months preparing for this, Cho said. Not preparing to fight you, High Curator. Preparing for this. Every shipyard you demanded we surrender. Every fleet you dismissed as ceremonial. All of it exists because of the undertow, not despite it. Our system is stabilized. As of this recording, we are safe. Vey's ceremonial collar suddenly felt too tight. Around him, his remaining advisors had gone utterly still. We came to the dome today, prepared to offer you our stabilization technology, Cho went on, his tone hardening for the first time. Designs built specifically to counter a threat you don't yet understand is already moving through your own territory. All we asked in return was to be treated as partners, not property. You answered with a leash and a bill for the privilege of wearing it. He leaned toward the camera, and for a moment the careful calm in his expression thinned, revealing something colder underneath. So we're leaving you to it. Our observatories estimate the undertow reaches your outer member systems within 38 standard hours. We won't be answering hails after this transmission ends. Whatever you pray to, Curator, I'd start now. The hologram flickered and died. The annex fell into a silence so complete, Vey could hear his own secondary heart working overtime beneath his ribs. Thes stared at the space where the projection had hung, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. On his own console, the tactical display updated automatically. populated with fragments of telemetry data bleeding in from the human transmission's attached coordinates. Then, one by one, warning markers began flashing along the Concordance's outermost observation network. Marshall, an analyst called out, voice tight with barely controlled panic. Deep space relay stations at the Varian cluster border, sectors 12 through 16. They've gone dark. All within the same 90-second window. Stasis' throat worked. That's not possible. Those stations are hardened against. They're not reporting an attack, sir. The analyst's hands hovered over the console, shaking. The stars themselves have gone dark. No distress signal. No debris field. The systems are just not producing light anymore. Vey rose slowly from his chair, his ceremonial collar suddenly feeling less like a symbol of authority and more like a costume he no longer had any right to wear. He thought of the three humans walking calmly through the dome's exit doors, unafraid, unhurried, not the posture of a species retreating from failure, but of one that had already made peace with a truth the rest of the galaxy hadn't yet been forced to confront. They weren't running from us, he realized, the thought settling into his chest like a blade sliding home. They were running from something that makes 8,000 years of Concordance authority look like a children's argument over territory that's about to stop existing entirely. Recall every long-range scout in the Varian cluster, Vey said, his voice hollow. I want direct observation of this undertow within the hour. Curator Thess said quietly, and the humans. Vey turned toward the Annex's single narrow viewport, where the ancient lights of the Concordance capital still glittered against the dark, beautiful, ancient, and for the first time in 8,000 years, entirely undefended by anyone who actually understood what was coming for them. Find out if the human ambassador was exaggerating, Vey said. Pray, Marshal, that he was. Some old, instinctive part of him, the part that had survived 8 millennia of politics, treaties, and quiet wars, already understood, with sick certainty, that Ambassador Cho had not exaggerated anything at all. The undertow did not announce itself with weapons. 30-9 hours after Ambassador Cho's broadcast, the Concordance's first Sentinel wing, 600 vessels strong, a fleet that had not lost a border engagement in over 1,000 years, arrived at the edge of Sector 14 to observe the phenomenon. That had silenced 5 relay stations without leaving so much as a debris trail. Fleet Marshal Corvin Thess stood on the bridge of the flagship Ashwind, watching the forward sensor array struggle to render something his instruments simply weren't built to describe. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't look like a swarm. It looked like a wrongness, a slow, spreading dimness where stars should have burned, as though someone had reached into the fabric of the system ahead and simply turned the brightness down, star by star, with patient, mechanical indifference. Marshal, his sensor officer said, voice tight. I'm reading gravitational fluctuations across the entire forward sector. Nothing localized. It's not a single object, sir. It's the space itself destabilizing. Then show me what's causing it. Tess snapped, though his own hands had curled white-knuckled around the command rail, the nearest star in Sector 14, a modest yellow dwarf that had burned steadily for 9 billion years. Flickered dot. Then it collapsed. Not an explosion. Not a supernova's violent bloom. The star simply folded inward on itself in the space of 11 seconds. Its planetary system's gravity, while twisting violently as unimaginable mass, compressed into something the Concordance's own sensors labeled uselessly as anomalous. The shock wave that followed wasn't fire or radiation. It was a wave of gravitational distortion that rolled outward and struck the leading edge of the Sentinel wing before any evasive order could be given. The escort cruiser Varenhold didn't explode. Its hull simply began to crumple, metal folding in on itself as though an invisible fist had closed around it. The ship's structural integrity fields overwhelmed in seconds. The crew's final transmission cut off mid-sentence, not with static, but with silence, as though the very radio waves carrying their voices had been crushed along with the hull. All ships, reverse thrust, maximum burn. This roared. Get us out of the gravitational shear radius. The fleet scattered, but the distortion wave moved faster than anything with mass could outrun. A second cruiser lost its engines entirely, spinning helplessly toward the dying star's collapsing remnant. A third simply began to stretch, its hull elongating in ways that violated every principle of structural engineering the Concordance had ever relied upon. Before it, too, went silent. Report, Thess demanded, his voice raw. 3 vessels lost. Marshal, not destroyed. I don't know how else to describe it. Crushed, absorbed into the collapsed remnant. There's nothing left to recover. It's on the tactical display. 3 more stars in the sector began to flicker, the same slow dimming preceding each catastrophic collapse, the pattern spreading outward with a patience that felt almost deliberate, as though something intelligent, or something that didn't need to be intelligent to be lethal, was simply working its way through every star in its path. This isn't a swarm, this whispered, mostly to himself. It's not even a weapon. It's just stars dying faster than they should, one after another. 6 minutes after the Sentinel Wing's arrival, 40 ships had been lost, not to combat, but to a phenomenon that didn't seem to notice they existed at all. There was no valor to be found in the deaths, no glorious defense to report. The undertow didn't fight the Concordance fleet. It simply continued unmaking the physics that held nearby stars together. And anything caught within that unraveling ceased to matter. Fall back. Thess finally ordered, all pretense of composure gone from his voice. All ships, full retreat to the capital defense line. The surviving vessels burned hard for open space, and behind them the undertow continued its slow, indifferent progression through Sector 14, not pursuing, not needing to. It didn't have to chase anything. Everything in its path was already standing still relative to something that unmade the rules stars themselves depended on to exist. Back in the Halcyon case, High Curator Aslan Vey watched the tactical feed die, marker by marker, ship by ship, until the silence in the room felt heavier than anything in 8,000 years of Concordance history. He thought of Ambassador Cho's recorded voice, calm and unbothered, delivering a warning the Concordance had dismissed as posturing from a species too young to understand its own insignificance. We fortified our sector. As of this recording, we are safe. Vey had assumed it was theater, a newcomer's desperate bluff, dressed up in confident diplomacy. He understood now, with a clarity that had arrived catastrophically late, that it had never been theater at all. It had been the simple, unhurried confidence of a species that had already looked directly at this horror and built something capable of surviving it, while the Concordance had spent that same 14 months drafting tariffs for a species it should have been begging to share its secrets. Send every diplomatic channel we have to solve, they said, quietly, to no one and everyone at once. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what pride it requires us to swallow. Curator, an aide said carefully. The human embassy severed every known contact frequency before their departure. Their entire sector shows a total communications blackout. Vey closed all 4 eyes. Beyond the annex's narrow viewport, the ancient spires of the Concordance capital still glittered. Untouched, for now, beautiful, impossibly old, and utterly unprepared for something that had just proven it could unmake a 1,000-year, unbeaten fleet in 6 minutes without firing a single weapon of its own. For the first time in his impossibly long life, High Curator Aslan Vey understood, with total and humiliating clarity, exactly what it felt like to be small. The stealth scout Umber Wing dropped out of slipstream at the absolute edge of charted Concordance space. Its hull, dampened to near invisibility. Its three-person crew holding their breath as though the void itself might overhear them. Fleet Marshal Corvin Thess had volunteered for this mission personally, not from courage, but from a desperation that had grown sharper with every hour the Halcyon Dome's chronometers ticked toward the projected arrival of the Undertow at the capital. Command needed one answer above all else. Had the humans actually survived? And if their stabilization technology was real, whether it could be extended to save anyone else at all. Visual contact in 10 seconds, the pilot murmured. When the feed cleared, Thess forgot, briefly, how his own species breathed. Soul burned exactly as it always had. A steady, unremarkable yellow star, precisely where astronomical records said it should be. But surrounding it, woven through the system in a lattice, too vast and precise to have occurred naturally, hung thousands of slender gravitic arrays, each the size of a small moon, arranged in concentric shells around the star itself, like a cage built for something the Concordants had never imagined needed caging. That's not a defense grid, Thess said slowly. That's an entire star, held in a harness. Sir, the sensor officer's voice cracked. I'm reading active gravitational modulation across the whole array network. They're not just monitoring the star's core. They're actively suppressing something. On the display, the telemetry data resolved into a slow, rhythmic pulse, the arrays subtly adjusting Sol's internal gravitational pressure, moment by moment, compensating for fluctuations that left unchecked would have mirrored exactly the kind of premature collapse that had swallowed 6 stars in Sector 14. They found the same instability we're seeing everywhere the Undertow passes, Thess murmured. And they didn't wait for it to happen. They built something to stop it before it started. So additional contact, the pilot said, voice tight. Small distortion signature, bearing 294. It's the Undertow, a leading tendril, testing the edge of their system on the display. The same slow gravitational flickering that had preceded every stellar collapse in Sector 14 began at the outer edge of the human array network. A faint dimming in the space between two of Sol's outer arrays, the telltale sign of the Undertow, tempting to unravel the star's stability from a distance. It touched the array field, and the collapse pattern simply stopped for a long moment. Thess expected the destabilization to accelerate the way it had against every concordant sensor station that had tried to observe it up close. Instead, the arrays surrounding that section of the field flared with a soft, violet light, gravitic fields interlocking and stiffening, forcibly correcting the distortion the Undertow had tried to seed. The dimming reversed. The instability, whatever it was, simply couldn't take hold against a system actively fighting to hold itself together. By the ancestors, the pilot whispered. It's not a shield. It's not even a weapon. It's just stability. They built something that refuses to fall apart. Thess stared at the display, at the sheer scale of what humanity had constructed in 14 months while the Concordants had spent that same time drafting tariffs on rare hydrogen. Transmit, he ordered, his voice rough with something he hadn't felt in centuries, genuine humility. Emergency channel. Tell them the Concordance requests contact. Tell them we'll withdraw every demand, every tariff, every condition. We need to know if this technology can be shared before 6 more stars go dark. The pilot's hands moved across the console. Before the transmission could complete, the array network's automated systems responded first, a single, narrow gravitic pulse that didn't damage the Umberwing at all, but gently, precisely, disabled its slipstream capacitor, stranding it on conventional engines. A voice followed. .com, entirely without malice, which somehow made it worse. Authorized vessel. You have entered a restricted stabilization perimeter during an active stellar emergency. Faster-than-light systems have been disabled for the safety of this array network. Retreat to minimum safe distance on impulse power. The Sol Directorate is not currently accepting external contact. This is not hostility. This is a courtesy you have not yet earned. The channel cut. Tess sat in silence as the pilot fought to bring the crippled ship about. The vast lattice of gravitic arrays receding slowly in the rear display, a monument to a species the Concordance had, 4 days earlier, tried to fit with a 15-vessel leash and a 50% tariff. He thought of High Curator Vey's instructions before the mission had launched. Find out if the human ambassador was exaggerating. He hadn't been exaggerating. He had been almost generous in how he described it, understating a capability that made the entirety of Concordance stellar engineering look like children stacking stones against a rising tide back on the Concordance capital. The report reached High Curator Vey in fragments. First, the scout's disabled status, then the recording, then, hardest of all to absorb, the silence that followed it. He watched the footage of Saul's arrays correcting the undertow's collapse, its pattern perhaps a dozen times, searching for some flaw, some limitation, some proof that the humans were as fragile as the Concordance had assumed only days earlier. He found none. Options, he said finally, to the handful of advisors still gathered in the annex. Half his original war council was gone now, some lost in a failed observation of Sector 14, others simply silent, their outlying stations swallowed along with the stars they'd been monitoring. No one answered immediately. There are no options. Curator, his last remaining fleet analyst, said quietly. The undertow reaches our capital system in under 60 hours. Our fleet cannot stop it. Our observatories cannot even properly measure it. The only stabilization technology in this galaxy proven to work belongs to the one species we've spent the last 2 years trying to indenture. Vey turned toward the annex's narrow viewport, toward ancient spires that had stood for 8,000 years and now had less than 3 days remaining to stand at all. Somewhere beyond the Vantar Sea deep, behind a lattice of violet light and quiet, unforgiving competence, humanity was watching the galaxy's stars flicker out one by one, and, so far, doing absolutely nothing to stop it. He understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only when it's far too late to matter, exactly why. 60 hours became 31, 31 became 9. And on the 51st hour, far ahead of even the war annex's most desperate projections, the Concordance capital's own star, a golden giant that had burned steadily for the entirety of recorded history, began, unmistakably. Too dim. High Curator Vey stood on the observation deck of the Halcyon Dome, a structure that had watched 8,000 years of Concordance history unfold beneath its lattice ceiling, and looked up at the slow death of the only son his species had ever known. The undertow did not arrive as an invading fleet. It arrived the way it always did, a patient unraveling that began at the edges of perception and spread inward. The capital star's corona flickered, its usual steady gold guttering toward something duller, more orange, more wrong. Emergency broadcasts across every populated world in the system began, cataloging tremors in planetary cores that shouldn't have existed, gravitational fluctuations that made structural engineers across a dozen species report readings. Their instruments weren't designed to produce below the dome. The streets of the capital's orbital ring had become currents of panicked citizens' thrill. Varen, a dozen other species that had spent millennia believing their civilization untouchable, scrambling toward shelters that everyone privately understood would do nothing at all against a star, quietly forgetting how to exist. Evacuation status, Vey said, his voice flat, drained of the authority it had carried across 100 centuries. Okay, there's no evacuation. Curator, Fleet Marshal Thess, stood beside him now, his uniform still scorched faintly from his crippled scouting run, his earlier bravado long since burned away to nothing. Where would anyone go? The undertow doesn't have a border we can retreat behind. If the star goes, the entire system goes with it. Okay, A tremor rolled through the observation deck's foundations as the first measurable core fluctuations reached critical thresholds, where the star's corona flickered, a golden light bathing the capital, dimmed by a fraction that no citizen below could consciously perceive. But every instrument in the system screamed about in unison. "A teen, then we die here," they said quietly. Perhaps as we deserved to. We had the chance to stand beside the one species that saw this coming and prepared for it. We chose to hand them a tariff instead. Thess said nothing. There was nothing left worth saying. The star's collapse accelerated an hour later, the corona guttering visibly now. The sky above the capital shifting toward a sickly orange twilight that had never once, in 8,000 years, touched the system at midday. Emergency broadcasts stopped cataloging tremors and started cataloging casualties, orbital habitats losing structural integrity as the gravitational shifts rippled outward, populations trapped in shelters that groaned under stresses no engineer had ever designed for. They closed all four eyes, bracing for a death he had never once imagined 8,000 years of rule would end with. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. It happened all at once, violent pressure shift, as though the sky had inhaled sharply and forgotten to exhale. The temperature across the entire observation deck plummeted, ticked, frost blooming instantly along the transparent lattice overhead. A sound like tearing metal rolled across the visible horizon, deep and resonant, audible even through the dome's reinforced structure. Vey opened his eyes, directly above the dimming capital star. The fabric of local space itself split open, not the smooth, practiced elegance of a standard slipstream transit, but something raw, forced apart rather than gently parted. Violeted tears bled light across the darkening sky, and through them shapes began pouring through in tight, disciplined formation. They were not the ceremonial vessels of the Concordance's own fleet. They were blunt, utilitarian things, dark composite hulls, unadorned except for stark corporate lettering and the bold, angular seal of the United Nations Space Command. Dozens emerged, then hundreds, arranging themselves with a precision that spoke of simulations run 1,000 times before this exact moment ever arrived at the heart of the formation. A single vessel emerged that dwarfed everything around it, its gravitational signature alone sending measurable ripples through the capital's already unstable orbital mechanics. Painted across its hull in stark white letters, visible even from the observation deck, was a single word: anchor. Possible, Thess whispered, staring upward with an expression Vey had never once seen cross the marshal's face. Not fear, something closer to disbelief mixed with something that might, given time, become gratitude. The human fleet didn't hesitate, didn't broadcast a demand, didn't wait for Concordance authorization that would never have been granted in time regardless. Dozens of gravitic stabilization arrays unfolded from the underbellies of the lead vessels, weaving together into a lattice of violet light that enveloped the entire capital star system in the span of minutes, the impact of the stabilization field striking the dying star's corona was immediate and visible even from the surface, a pulse of restored gold light, rippling outward from the star's core, the sickly orange retreating as the human arrays forced the collapsing stellar processes back into something the universe could tolerate. Vey gripped the frost-covered railing, half expecting the effort to fail the way every Concordance countermeasure had failed before it held, where the array's violet fields wrapped around the star's destabilizing core. The same correction Thess had witnessed at Sol rippled outward here, forcing the collapse pattern to reverse, the star's corona brightening back toward its familiar steady gold. Then, from the anchor's prow, a secondary pulse fired, not at a star, but outward into the surrounding system. Sweeping through the scattered gravitational distortions, the undertow had already seeded in the outer planet's orbits, correcting each one with the same relentless Mechanical precision. Human frigates broke formation, diving through the stabilization lattice toward the outer planets like engineers rushing toward a collapsing structure. Their systems working in concert to reinforce every fracture point the undertow had already begun to exploit in less than 25 minutes against a threat that had swallowed 6 stars in a single sector within hours. The capital sun burned steady gold once more, and the tremors rippling through every populated world in the system slowly, gradually subsided. Vey stood on his observation deck, staring up at the violet lattice that had just saved everything he had ever ruled over, and felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing at all to do with relief. A communication channel forced itself open on his personal terminal, overriding every concordant security protocol as though they were paper formalities. The hologram flickered to life. Ambassador Daniel Cho stood in the projection, no longer wearing his charcoal diplomat suit. He wore the dark utilitarian uniform of the UNSC now, unadorned by rank insignia, and somehow that plainness made him look far more formidable than any ceremonial dress ever could. "Hi, Curator Vey," Cho said, his voice as calm and unhurried as it had been the day he'd walked out of the Halcyon Dome. "I believe we have quite a lot to discuss." Gay lowered himself, slowly, deliberately, to his knees before the projection, 8,000 years of unbroken pride draining out of him all at once. "Ambassador Cho, you came. You saved us. The Concordance, we were wrong. We were arrogant, blind." "Get up, Curator," Cho said, his tone cutting cleanly through the apology. "I didn't come all this way to watch you grovel." "Hi, Curator." Ocelon Vey rose on unsteady legs, staring into the projection of the man who had just, without asking permission from a single Concordance authority, reversed the death of an entire star system. "We didn't come back for gratitude," Cho said, before Vey could speak again. "We came because the mathematics demanded it. Undertow collapse events don't stay contained model. The propagation far enough, and it eventually reaches our own border, regardless of how well we've stabilized Sol. This was necessity. Curator, not mercy." He lifted a data slate, its glow steady in the projection. "That said," Cho continued, "given what we've learned about how the Concordance treats species newer than itself, I think it's worth discussing what happens next, before anyone starts assuming the old arrangement simply resumes." Vey braced for it, the crushing document he had, in his private moments over the last 3 days, fully expected. The mirror of everything the Concordance had once tried to impose on humanity turned back on him with interest. "I have a proposal," Cho said instead. "Not a mandate. A proposal, Curator. Because I think you've learned something in the last 4 days about the difference." Vey said nothing, waiting. "Shh. The Sol Directorate is prepared to share stabilization array schematics with any Concordant system currently in the Undertow's projected path," Cho said. "Not sold. Not leveraged for tariffs. Shared, starting within 72 hours. Beginning with your capital's outer colonies and radiating outward as fast as we can manufacture and deploy the hardware. In exchange for," Vey started, "in exchange for nothing you haven't already been asked for by every other species that's ever needed help," Cho said. "A joint stabilization council, co-chaired, not subordinate to either of us. Full data sharing going forward, in both directions, because frankly, Curator, your astronomers have 8,000 years of stellar observation data we'd very much like access to, and we're not interested in pretending we don't need it." Vey's remaining advisors exchanged glances that Vey didn't need his eyes to read: disbelief, cautious and unpracticed. "That's the entire proposal," Cho said. "No tariff, no apprenticeship, no probationary seat at some outer table designed to remind us of our place. Just 2 species that both nearly lost everything this week, deciding whether they'd rather rebuild separately or together." "Why?" Vey asked slowly. "Would you offer this after everything the Concordance tried to take from you 4 days ago? Cho was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, something in his voice had shifted. Less ambassador. More simply, a man who had spent 3 sleepless days watching stars flicker toward death across a dozen systems that weren't his own, because we watched what happened when the undertow reached systems that had no one willing to help them, Cho said. 6 stars gone in Sector 14. Entire populations gone with them because nobody got there in time. We had the technology to prevent some of that. And for about 18 hours after your fleet's report came in, we debated whether your arrogance meant you deserved to face the rest of it alone. What changed your mind? Nothing changed, Cho said. We were never actually debating it that seriously. It just felt better, for a while, to imagine we might. In the end, letting a few 100 billion people die to make a point about a briefcase and a tariff never got past the first hour of that conversation. We're not interested in building whatever comes next on that foundation, Curator. You've already tried building an empire on it. Look at how close it came to costing you everything. Vey absorbed this in silence, the weight of it settling somewhere he had no ceremonial word for. The Joint Council, Cho added, meet for the first time in 6 days. Once the immediate crisis in your system is fully stabilized, Dr. Reyes Okonkwo will represent Saul's technical delegation. I'd suggest sending whoever within the Concordance actually understands stellar mechanics, rather than whoever holds the most ceremonial rank. We've had quite enough ceremony this week. Not if the Concordance refuses this council, Vey asked quietly, and simply attempts to reverse engineer your technology from what your fleet has already demonstrated. Then you'll spend the next decade failing to reverse engineer something built on principles your physicists haven't discovered yet, Cho said, without malice, simply stating a fact. In the next undertow event, because there will be one. This wasn't a singular occurrence. We'll find you exactly where the last one nearly did. That's not a threat, Curator. It's just the honest shape of the choice in front of you. The hologram lingered a moment longer. For what it's worth, Cho said, before the projection began to fade. The humans who walked out of your dome 4 days ago and the humans standing in your sky right now aren't different people. We were always willing to build something together. You never gave us a reason to believe you actually wanted that, until the alternative became losing everything at once. The hologram flickered out, leaving Vey alone on the observation deck as the last fading distortions of the undertow's passage retreated. Beyond the system's edge, chased by human frigates conducting what looked, from this distance, less like pursuit and more like careful, methodical cleanup below him, across a capital that had nearly lost its sun, and now, improbably, would not. Golden light returned to streets that had spent the last hour bathed in the sickly orange of a dying star. Vey, 8,000-year steward of a civilization that just been humbled, rescued, and offered something it had never once considered extending to anyone else, understood, with a particular clarity that only surviving the unthinkable grants a person, that the galaxy he had inherited was already gone. In its place stood something unfamiliar. Not a hierarchy measuring species by age and armament, but something humanity had apparently understood, long before anyone had bothered to ask them properly, that the only alliances worth building were the ones that survive being offered freely, not the ones extracted at the edge of somebody else's desperation. Asterisk. If this story gripped you as much as it gripped us while writing it, please drop a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because we've got even more HFY stories on the way that you won't want to miss. Let us know in the comments if you were in Curator Vey's position after Cho's final line. This isn't a threat, it's just the honest shape of the choice in front of you. Would you have genuinely accepted that joint council? Or would your species have fallen back into its old habits? I'll be replying to the most interesting theories down below. This story is entirely fictional. All characters, species, and events depicted are imaginary, and any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental.